she was such a beautiful and big ship.
I placed my lantern today because it was important to me. Titanic was important to me.
It was an achievement for Titanic to be built at that time, and we built her.
We're here to commemorate and to celebrate the centenary of Titanic. It's not about looking back, but about looking forward. The children represent with their lanterns a little bit of light into the future.
Titanic was a triumph for Belfast and a tragedy for the world. For 100 years, the story of the most famous ship ever has intrigued and entranced. But the tale would never have had a beginning if it weren't for one extraordinary family. Lord Peary, who dreamt up Titanic, and his nephew, naval architect Thomas Andrews, who designed her. Their descendants have rarely talked about Titanic. But a century to the day after the ship launched, on the 31st of May 1911, they came together in Belfast for a unique family reunion and to break their silence.
I think the centenary of the launch of the ship is a time for the family to be proud of themselves, because it was a fantastic, amazing achievement.
We can grieve over the tragedy, but we must applaud the effort, the daring to leap.
We really are here to celebrate a great tradition of entrepreneurship.
It's certainly part of the family history. Part of its history is sadness and pride in that an amazing ship came from Belfast.
Meeting with these extended family cousins from all over the world and this family reunion, and that maybe we can have some closure.
Well, she was a magnificent ship. I think it's fitting that we should be in Belfast.
So how many have you got on your list, Johnny?
Well, it's about 100, and amazing your numbers tie up with mine.
And we've got at least one representative for each branch of the family, which is fantastic.
It's really exciting putting together all this missing family history. But it's not just Titanic, it's the 11 other ships that were built in that year and the hundreds of other ships that William James Peary instigated under his authority at Harland Wolff.
There's going to be over 100 at the Harbour Office from all over the world, from Australia, Canada, USA, South Africa, Bahamas, and then England, Scotland, Wales, all being done by email, mainly a couple of phone calls.
Well, certainly their descendants.
Yes. Won't be everyone. There's Captain William.
Oh, yes.
And his wife came from Scotland.
The Pearys were one of the most successful Ulster families of the Victorian age. Linked by marriage to other local business dynasties, their connections stretched across the province. From linen manufacture to meat processing and shipping, they were strategically placed for expansion.
Well, we're all going to be the descendants of Captain William Peary, who was Lord Peary's grandfather, but my great-great-great-grandfather, we know was born in Scotland. His children married into prominent Belfast families. The Barbers, who obviously the Thread people, the next generation down into the Andrews family, and my own family, his daughter Eliza married John Sinclair, and they had a big meat packing business. Very significant members of the community, the business life in Belfast and the surrounding area.
So does it help to explain it this way, that this is the level of Lord Peary here, so this is the Titanic generation, this is his cousin? I've been thinking about the Belfast connections for years and years. We've heard about them sort of in the background, and there have been pictures in the house and all over the place. Of course, very aware of the Titanic connection, but never really sort of pieced it all together to make sense of it all. So that's the exciting bit, really, is that perhaps we're going to get it into shape at last. It feels a bit like a direct line just because the name is the same. But I suppose the right way of looking at it is my granddad's dad was the cousin of Lord Pirrie. So that's where we fit in. And it's sort of quite interesting seeing the differences in terms of the family. There seem to be these sort of incredibly thrusting, high-achieving individuals. And we are completely dwarfed by some of the things that were achieved. Love it if I get a sense of coming home to Belfast.
I think the family are very excited about coming to Belfast because they're coming from all over the world, and we're really looking forward to this gathering because Belfast seems the right place to be, and we haven't met each other.
It was in shipbuilding the Pirrie family excelled. As chairman of Harland and Wolff, Lord William Pirrie transformed a regional company into a global shipbuilder.
Harland and Wolff at the time, it was the equivalent of, Apple or Bill Gates. It was the biggest shipyard at the time. The technology was incredible. Lord Pirrie was the driving force behind Harland and Wolff, and the decision to build these superliners, of which Titanic is the most famous, and the dynamism that he exhibited through his international connections. There was incredible drive and determination to succeed.
I suppose as I was growing up, I didn't really know that we had anything to do with the Titanic, but obviously as I grew older and I was chatting to my great-grandparents, Norman and Ursula Pirrie. Norman Pirrie was the youngest grandchild of Captain William and first cousin to Lord Pirrie, and Norman followed Lord Pirrie to Harland and Wolff, that particular branch that went into the shipbuilding industry, and they all seem to have such amazing energy and self-belief. And for Belfast, of course, that was the turning point.
It's important to us as a family that we celebrate the launch of Titanic. It's really exciting putting together all this missing family history. Somewhere in the distant past, I'd heard grandfather talking about Uncle Willie Pirrie, and we really never really talked about these great uncles of ours, and Uncle Tommy as well. But it just was a subject not really spoken about because of the ultimate tragedy, and my grandfather obviously lost his uncle. The brothers were all incredibly gifted cricketers and sportsmen, and as a family we still enjoy sailing on Strangford Lough. This interest in sailing goes right back to Captain William Pirrie, the buccaneering spirit where he was sailing across the Atlantic. What it must have been like for Lord Pirrie and Uncle Tommy to launch this great ship.
Johnny Andrews' famous Uncle Thomas, designer of Titanic, was born to Thomas Andrews Sr. and his wife Eliza Pirrie of Ardara House, Cumber. The Andrews who ran the mill in the town were a high-achieving family. One son became a Prime Minister of Northern Ireland, another a Lord Chief Justice. Inspired by his uncle and chairman of Harland and Wolff, Lord Pirrie, Thomas joined the shipyard, entering as a premium apprentice at 15. His progress was swift. By 37, he was the company's chief naval architect and Lord Pirrie's right-hand man.
Thomas Andrews of the Titanic was unique. He was the only member of the Andrews family who went into the shipyard.
And I did read somewhere that Lord Pirrie didn't do him any favours. He had to make it on his own.
There were half a dozen of them at least at that kind of level of management. And they were all treated with great rigour. An apprentice was given a watch if he turned up on time every single day of the apprenticeship. and that Thomas Andrews didn't get it because he was 5 minutes late on one morning in his apprenticeship, which shows how rigorous the discipline was.
Yes.
They were all slaves to the work ethic, and Perry himself was relentless.
Thomas and his uncle Lord Peary were determined to make Harland and Wolff a world leader. The ambitious plans demanded a radical new approach to sales, a move which involved US financier J.P. Morgan. By 1911, the yard is launching around 8 ships a year.
There are plenty of stories of Perry's approach to this going into a new situation and not asking for a whole army of assistants and aides, and simply going and saying, I know what needs to be done, I'm going to do it. And I think that impressed people like J.P. Morgan. If you look at the connection that Perry developed with Morgan in terms of finance, with the White Star Line, Harland & Wolff was the sole supplier of liners to the White Star Line. Built something like 70 ships for them. No other shipyard in the world built for the White Star Line, so you could innovate. But it was also important because it provided a regular and reasonably assured revenue stream. And that was an attraction to the likes of a J.P. Morgan, because it indicated that there was a commercial nous behind this operation.
Gosh, this is incredible. It's a letter from Uncle Tommy to his mother, and this is to do with the impasse of the Harbour Board, where Harland & Wolff wanted to expand. Yes, he's being very critical. He's certainly outspoken here about comparing, it looks like the Harbour Commissioners was a narrow-minded lot of women, one half of them being too conceited in their own importance, and the other half too jealous to manage a rag store. You know, at a very young age, being given so much responsibility. At 26, he'd just been made a manager, and yet they were buying shipyards, and it was partly a political game to encourage the Harbour Commission to sell some land, I imagine, reading between the lines, in Belfast. Otherwise, they were going to go and set up shop in Scotland. These people are motivated from a non-conformist background, and they're very keen to prove themselves. And if the establishment get in the way, then so be it. The drive and focus, nothing will deter them.
In attracting the interest of the White Star Line and J.P. Morgan, Lord Peary and his nephew Thomas had arrived. And if you are shipbuilders to the world, it was important to have a major presence in the first city of empire. Downshire House, one of the finest addresses in the capital. It was here, after dinner in the summer of 1907, Lord Peary and White Star Line chairman Bruce Ismay agreed the deal to build a new breed of luxury liner. 3 ships were ordered: the Olympic, Britannic, and Titanic. Today, Downshire House is home to the Spanish Embassy.
Hello. Very nice to meet you. You're welcome. Hello.
Joining the family on their visit to Downshire House is Cliff Ismay, great-grandnephew of Bruce Ismay, Lord Peary's White Star Line partner.
Yes. We don't know, because this was probably smaller then, but this hall was exactly as it is, I think, except for the paintings that come from El Prado.
One can imagine Lord Peary sitting on one of those sofas with Bruce Ismay, planning the ships, and I think probably a lot of the decor for the ships came from that kind of lifestyle. I suppose you could envisage his lifestyle, which must have been very extravagant.
Stunning, isn't it? It's sort of a lot about, you know, power and having arrived and sort of feeling very comfortable with your position, you know, as really not quite running the show, but it's that sort of thing, you know, this is really where the world is being run from, isn't it?
It's really interesting to see it all, where these meetings took place, where they decided on these great ships and how they were going to build them, and
actually take over the world with their great new technology. You can imagine them having their sherries before dinner in here.
And it isn't just about having made it, this needs a huge amount of confidence and personality and strength and drive and vision to kind of carry off, doesn't it?
It was probably in this room where they sat down, I don't know, perhaps before dinner or after dinner, and they had a chat. They started thinking about this possibility of building the Titanic. But most likely it was in this room.
Yes, it was July 1907.
Yes.
Where they had a meeting here and decided on this great dream of 3 super Olympic-class ships.
Yeah.
So, Mr. Ismay, back in the room, I think, where it all kicked off.
Well, I think when you look around, it's easy to see how the idea of the 3 sister ships, Olympic, Titanic and Gigantic, how this idea was brought forward. You're surrounded by luxury, and to have these ships built to such grand luxuries as you see here, and they wanted to gear for the first-class passengers who were willing to pay such a lot of money for these surroundings.
It is quite amazing, really, when you think of the sheer scale of the project. The White Star Line had to mortgage their entire fleet to pay for the cost of these huge new liners. They spent more money on the 3 Olympic-class ships than the entire 23-ship fleet was worth in 1908.
I think the bit that's exciting is just how brave they were. I mean, the one I go to is the Race to the Moon, you know, where they sort of started building rockets and then they suddenly went for it. It was sort of that idea, wasn't it? It was, right, we're going to go for broke. And it was just this sort of incredible leap of confidence. And you wonder about whether it was, you know, folly to push it that hard. You see how if you did it here, you'd feel full of confidence, isn't it? You'd sort of think, well, we're sort of capable of anything here.
And the risk was immense because I think 1907, when they decided in this room to do it, the economy was not that good and they had a bit of a downturn, and yet they judged it absolutely perfectly because it went into an upturn leading up to the First World War.
Yes.
And yet they, I suppose there was that sort of trust and belief between the two of them that they were going to hold it together themselves. And so I guess that it needed 2 of them to do it, to go on supporting each other and to encourage each of them to go on making bigger and bigger dreams. And this is the place where it all unfolded. They believed that they were going to succeed. You know, this was pre-World War I, pre all those kind of events that we now know about. It was actually that they could steamroller through absolutely everything, wasn't it? Quite impressive.
See, this house brings back huge poignancy in the fact that this is where they dreamt up the dream of these 3 superliners.
They were staking their reputations and their futures on this great achieving, great striving, and they went for it.
There's still traces. I mean, you can see at the top of the building, it still has Oceanic House. So essentially confirms what it was, really.
And so this was the new centre after Liverpool, is that how it works?
Yes, it was the main London office for White Star.
But it's very much the heart, isn't it? Right off Trafalgar Square, right in the middle of everything.
Yeah, right in the middle of London.
And slightly shabby now, but you can see looking around that the sort of places were, and this is absolutely the heart of it, wasn't it? With all of the embassies and all of the national countries, and very impressive.
Yeah.
Today, the old White Star Line offices have been converted to a restaurant.
So this is it. We're in the White Star Line's London office, and this long counter here is now a restaurant, of course, but when White Star was here, this was the main counter, so people would come in and you know, they'd be greeted here.
Actually, that bit just there?
In this area between the 2 pillars, there was a great big a wooden desk, and then in front of it here you had 2 models. You had a model of Olympic and Titanic, and an oceanic model as well.
And this is where I'd come and book up my place?
Yeah, that's right.
And all classes, or is this only where the kind of posh guys come? I mean, if third class might come in here too, if they kind of can shoulder their way to the front, maybe?
I think more first and second, but...
Wow.
And it was a huge industry. I mean, the White Star Line was one of Britain's premier shipping lines. Yes.
And it really was big business.
Absolutely,
It
yes.
was the major form of transport across the world. There were no airlines then.
Yes, and the immigration trade was very popular as well. And they'd had a couple of record years when Olympic and Titanic were under construction.
This is how I can sort of get a sense of it, can't you? Sort of thinking that you're behind the ticket desk and waiting for people to come in. It feels, you know, much more immediate now. Fantastic office, isn't it? I mean, amazing sort of natural light, quite sort of powerful, quite an assertive building, isn't it? It's sort of, we're definitely here with the future, we're going places. Yeah.
And this fantastic, iconic building right in the middle of London, with Trafalgar Square in the background. You can imagine Lord Pirrie walking in with all his colleagues, and he was probably dropped off at the door by his chauffeur, and you know, he was Mr. Big in the big company of the period.
The sort of power of this building shows how stable it was, and you'd come in here and you knew that everything was going to be taken care of, and that was really the expectation, wasn't it? Was that travel was on this new cusp, it was completely safe, it was completely, you know, powerful, and you'd be looked after. And then suddenly everybody's entire worldview was rocked. And you can imagine as the people come to this office, you know, having kind of heard the news and not really knowing what's going on and not really believing it, you know, you can imagine the scenes out here. What a change.
When the ultimate tragedy hit, there must have been a deep sense of gloom around the building here. And I understand people were coming to find news of what had happened. And, you know, it is very moving. And yet the company went on, and it went on with other ships and continued to trade successfully way into the 1920s and 30s. They dealt with it, but it was obviously a huge tragedy.
It was generally assumed that Thomas Andrews was the chosen successor to Lord Pirrie, and he had a plan that he would take retirement at some point and that Thomas would take over. So when the Titanic sank, when Thomas was drowned with it, it changed history. Pirrie then had no heir to hand over to, and instead of retiring, he went on till he died. He stayed in harness, still running the shipyard until 1924.
The launch of the Titanic, the sinking of the Titanic, are very, very significant for Belfast and the north of Ireland. I think as we get closer, you do get, it comes into your thoughts more often. My grandfather, great-grandfather were relations, were quite close cousins of Thomas Andrews and the Pirries. So it was a family member going down with the ship as well. So there's always been a sadness in our family about it. My grandmother, who was married to William King and Captain Pirrie's great-grandson, I suppose, she got taken to see the Titanic being launched when she was 9. And great excitement, obviously. And then when it sank, she was absolutely devastated. And she never, ever, ever went to see a ship being launched after that, because she just thought she'd bring bad luck. And she never spoke about the Titanic to me. Never, ever, ever.
I grew up knowing all, well, 3 brothers anyway. I didn't know the sister. But they were part of my childhood, really, the family. And Johnny Andrews, the one who was the Prime Minister, of course, he was around a lot in our childhood. They were all great doers, you know. They, in a very quiet way, they weren't aggressive at all about it, but they just got on. I can remember the sort of feeling that there had been this huge impact in the family. Everybody was so shocked and horrified that it was rather like the Great War, where people don't talk about tragedies of in the past of their life. People just didn't really talk about him. I mean, we were very much aware of it, but the family wouldn't discuss it very much. He more or less admitted that he was wrong, and the ship sank, and he stayed with the boat because he wasn't going to run away from something he'd promised was unthinkable. That, I think, a bit of his character was the thing that really stuck in my mind as a child. The honesty, really sticking to his word, what struck me, and a memory I carry from those days about him.
Belfast was proud of that ship, and it must have been a feeling of total disbelief when it sank. And so I think they all went into a period of mourning for a very long time.
Sadly, sort of 2 weeks after the sinking of the Titanic, here's Auntie Nellie to her mother-in-law. Dear old Tommy could not bear to see anyone suffer, especially those he loved. His dear big heart was so tender to all who were in any trouble, and now that he cannot come back to us, let us cling the closer to each other and the little sweetheart baby girl he has left us.
Today, only images remain of the ancestral Pirrie home at Conlig. It was here, following his father's death, Lord Pirrie came to live with his grandmother Eliza and her husband, Captain William Pirrie, family patriarch and himself the founder of an international trading empire.
We have decided to do a watercolour as a gift showing key aspects of Captain Pirrie's life and of his family's life. Images include some ships, Conlig House, which he built just outside Belfast. When Lord Pirrie came back from Canada with his mother after his father had died, he went to live with his grandparents, and so he spent a lot of time in that house. A lot of his early years were spent growing up at Conlig House. Sadly, the house is no longer there, so it's really a memory now of something from the past that was very much a substantial part of Captain Pirrie's life, and that of his family members as well.
I think Conlig was important to the family. They all grew up there, and Lord Pirrie, or William James as he was then, and his sister Eliza, and indeed their mother, were taken in after the sad death of their father. And I think it was important to the members of the family because I think it was a place of refuge, and also it must have been a wonderful place for the children to grow up. And I just rather think that there must have been a very special bond that developed between grandfather and grandson. And the grandfather used to take William down to the harbour to see the ships, and there must have been something going on within William developing that interest.
It's wonderful to walk into the Harbour Commissioner's office in Belfast and feel that my great-great-great-grandfather was very much a part of the development of the Port of Belfast. I've been intrigued by Captain William, and the more I find out about him in being involved in the gathering, that I think he's a character that history has slightly overlooked. He was chairman of the Harbour Commissioners when the Victoria Channel was opened. He must have been a very, very inspiring character. He was somebody who wasn't afraid to take something and run with it. For example, the Victoria Channel in Belfast But he was a key member of the Harbour Commissioners who coordinated making that channel in Belfast, which ultimately led to the Titanic.
William Perry was very much a visionary who could see the future in Irish shipbuilding and helped make it happen. And so he also symbolises the role of Belfast Harbour Commissioners. Those were the people who decided to dig out all the mud around the old harbour and develop the channel. Otherwise, Belfast would not have grown, and probably the big port today would be Carrickfergus.
I think Captain William showed his, well, ambition, if you like, and great risk-taking when he was a young man, and I think that he passed that on to Lord Pirrie. To have that insight and ambition and self-drive and energy and the foresight to build these amazing ships. And of course his grandfather had paved the way by dredging the harbour, and so it almost, I would imagine, Lord Pirrie just gave him strength to strength.
Captain William, he was born in Scotland, Wigtownshire, on the coast. I'd love to think that I would be able to find somewhere in Scotland that I can identify with the place that he grew up in, a family home. I think there's a house or maybe a cottage where he grew up or where he was born. The son, we think, of a tenant farmer, and he, sort of at the turn of the 19th century, went off to America and made a lot of money in shipping slate from the mines of North Wales to house the rooftops of Manhattan.
Eliza Pirrie, Jane Pirrie, Letitia Hayne, and William. Names Captain Pirrie first gave to his children and then to his ships. But even before he had married and settled in Belfast, he was already established as an international merchant.
So Captain Pirrie was sailing first.
The family has uncovered evidence that by the early 1900s, the captain was already shipping slate to North America. Despite the Napoleonic Wars, he was soon successfully trading with the continent. By 1814, he had enough money to start shipbuilding in Belfast.
Captain Pirrie really developed large ships. They were the largest ships that they could possibly achieve within the space they had here in Belfast. And he was very much aware that you needed to have these large ships to carry people from Ireland across to the New World. He was very keen to develop the channel and have a proper seaway up to the port of Belfast. And this was just too deep for Belfast harbour at the time, and he was looking for other ports. Captain Pirrie, as an ageing sea captain, he felt in some way he could carry on this family tradition through his grandson, and this would lead on automatically to ships like the Oceanic, the Titanic, which were the largest in their day, I think.
There are certainly names on the baptismal records which would be great to follow up and try and locate exactly where they might be.
William Pirrie, son to John Pirrie and Elizabeth Murphy in Auchenmarg, was baptised by Mr. Learmont 26th January 1780.
I've arrived in Barlocket Farm and we're going to meet the lady who now lives here and we're going to go down and see if the cottage still exists where Captain Pirrie grew up.
Hello.
Hi, nice to meet you.
And you, welcome to Barlocket.
Thank you very much. So this is where Captain Pirrie grew up, this area?
Yes, he would have played in these fields here.
Wow.
And in the fields in front here. When I was a child, I played in these fields. Of course, the house has changed over the years, and I think each generation has made their own changes.
But it's such a homely kitchen, and just a great sense of being somewhere that means something to me. There's a sort of definitely a link, definitely.
It would have been a thatched house then, 1700.
Yeah.
Yes, it would have been pretty much as you see it now, because there was quite a bit of smuggling here in those days. There was movement to the Americas from this very area.
And then in New York?
Yes, for the development of New York, that was in the 1700s they were doing that. I find that quite amazing.
So there are obviously links,
yes,
strong links there as well.
There must have been, yes. From the bedroom window you can see the lighthouse, the Mull of Galloway lighthouse, flashing at night. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
So as a child, he would have seen the lighthouse. Yeah, it's a nice thought. Maybe it was always calling all of us to go and see the world and seek our fortunes.
I think some of the inspiration for Titanic came from here. The drive that later members of the family put into business. Captain Pirrie was obviously a people person, and I think he was maybe a link, the missing link into that bit of the history of Ireland and the docks and Belfast and my family. Part of the story of Titanic started here in this whitewashed cottage on the west coast of Scotland. A boy who was inspired by ships and sailing in the sea, and his family then were involved in building the Titanic, and that drive, determination and ambition came from here.
It's a one-off occasion. I think the fact that it's also the same weekend that the Titanic was launched, so I think it's definitely going to be quite a unique occasion.
I'm really looking forward to meeting all the relatives that we've communicated with, but we don't know them, so it's going to be really fun.
Nice to see you. Oh, not good.
I don't know, I think this is really the core of Belfast Harbour here.
We have the Harbour Office in the background where Uncle Willie Pirrie and Uncle Tommy had their offices.
Yes.
And then here we have slipway number 2, which was the Olympic, and 3 was the Titanic.
The fact that Titanic went into the water and started its sea life here, really, didn't it? Just looking at it from here and imagining what it would have been like, you know, it's very moving.
It's quite humbling to see how, widely we've spread. And when you look around the harbour, to think that Captain Pirrie came and almost visualised not so much of what became, in that we know that he, dredged the harbour and put in the shipyards, and it wasn't so many generations before this became, Belfast became shipbuilders to the world.
I'm from New York. You're from New York, that's right.
I come from Sydney in New South Wales, Australia. Yes, and my ancestor was Jane Pirrie, who was the youngest daughter of Captain William, and I'm descended from her daughter Eliza Morrison Pirrie.
Thomas Andrews, who was the architect of the Titanic, was my grandfather's cousin.
And here is the family tree of the Titanic, almost as big as the ship itself.
My great-grandmother was William James Pirrie's sister, who married Thomas Andrews.
I'm currently living in the Bahamas, where I've been for the last 14 years.
I never knew there were so many Pirries.
Well, my great-great-grandfather was John Miller Pirrie, who was one of the sons of Captain William Pirrie.
A real buzz about this, and there seems to be a real connection building up between all these people and all these cousins, and we're all calling each other cousin now.
I actually made my outfit. Why don't you take my shawl off? And I was a little worried because, I know I'm an American and I'm different and all of that. But I thought, well, what the heck?
The launch, as you know, is just a few days away from now. And for me, this is so much of my heritage. And to come back to Belfast, and this is what put Belfast on the map.
Ella Pirrie was the
It's hard to believe that it's actually happening in this beautiful building. It's just the perfect place.
This occasion is particularly poignant in that it brings together all the threads of the industrial and maritime heritage of Belfast, which created that great vessel.
Without people like Captain William Perry and his grandson, Lord Perry, you would have no harbour of any size, no shipbuilding, no Titanic, no Olympic, no Canberra. You would have had a smaller port and maybe a rather nice marina. So he's one of the very most important people in the history of the harbour and of Belfast.
A short distance from Belfast city centre is Clifton Street Cemetery, the final resting place of Captain William Pirrie and his wife, Eliza.
You sort of assume that graves are going to be there forever, don't you? They're the monument of what you've done and what you've achieved, and but no. And that's really it. It's sort of amazing the way it's all kind of melted away.
Yeah, it is.
I'm thinking there's a little bit like the Titanic in a way, that there's, the idea of him is still here.
Yeah.
But this is all kind of almost disappearing into the ground, really. It's interesting how we, as we sort of strive and drive forward, we almost forget the people who've taken us there, which is perhaps as it should be.
It's pretty amazing.
We've just been to see the grave of Captain William. Not a great event, really, in terms of the stones have melted and there's not much to see there. And it's interesting how, there was this sort of great spring in the heart of Belfast that sort of so much has come from. And I guess, like all of us, we're just going to go back into the ground and melt away.
Until you're actually standing there, and suddenly 100 years will seem just like yesterday, I'm sure.
Meeting with these extended family cousins from all over the world, and this family reunion that we're putting on has given some sort of closure on it, where we've been able to bring the family together and talk about it and celebrate it. Because of the tragedy, the people of Belfast and even the family weren't sure how to deal with it. But maybe we can have some closure, and now we can commemorate.
It's so hard to look back at the launch other than through the lens of the tragedy. But at the time, 100 years ago, it was just this extraordinary achievement. Because I sort of carry the name, I have a sense of sort of responsibility and a deep sorrow.
I think sadly, when that tragedy happened and the ship sank, was devastating for the family and for all those people connected with the building of the ship, and not just the people who built the ship, but I suspect the whole of Belfast. Lord Pirrie was never quite the same man again. He not only had lost the ship of his dreams, but he lost his beloved nephew, Thomas. I think that was a pivotal moment in his life.
It's unbelievable for me to be standing in the same place that my grandmother stood 100 years ago as a little girl, aged 8, watching the launch of the great ship, the Titanic. And for me, this is a very emotional moment. I'm feeling very amazed to be here and delighted, and that this is part of my family's heritage, and I'm able to be with her, and she's here in spirit. This is a tremendous day.
They that go down to the sea in ships, that do business in great waters, these see the works of the Lord and his wonders in the deep.
And there's this tension, isn't there, between the bold endeavour on the one hand and the sort of maybe fearlessness going into recklessness on the other. And there's a moment when it tips too far, there's a moment when it becomes dangerous, and that's really what we saw in 1912. But at the moment that we're celebrating, it's really the achievement of 1911, and that's the bit that I hope we can hang on to. Without the boldness, there would never have been a Titanic.
The ship was a wonderful and magnificent ship. And we mustn't let, I think, the tragedy take away from the achievement.